Hello, I'd like to welcome you to the online ministry of Mount Pleasant Baptist Church in Northampton. My name is Andrea Smith and I'm one of the elders at the church. And this is our word for the week. And I've been looking at a series of women in the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, just to see what their lives can teach us and how God dealt in their situations and how that might be relevant and helpful for us today. So the character I'm looking at today is Abigail, and she is a lady who is found in the Old Testament, in the book of 1 Samuel. So just to give a little bit of background, if we think about 1 Samuel, it's the beginning of it is where the Israelites want a king of their own. So they would be like the neighbouring tribes, really. And so the prophet Samuel anoints a man called Saul, who had a wonderful standing in the community. And God let it be known to Samuel this was the man of his choosing. So Samuel anoints Saul and he becomes king. And to begin with, all goes very well. But unfortunately, Saul did not continue to follow God. And so God knew that a new king was needed. And so shepherd boy David, son of Jesse, he was the man that God chose to succeed King Saul, to be the king of Israel. And he's known throughout the Bible as a man after God's own heart. It becomes apparent to Saul, it's revealed to Saul, that David will succeed him as king. And whereas their relationship started very well, Saul became incredibly jealous of David. And we quite often see that David was on the run for his very life. And on this particular occasion, the story, where we're going to think about Abigail, we have this situation where David is on the run with 600 fighting men. And I must just say this lovely verse in the Bible. I can't let it go without mentioning it because I think it's so beautiful. King Saul had a son called Jonathan, who was a great friend of David's. And when David was at his lowest, we have this lovely verse in 1 Samuel 23 that says this: "And Saul's son Jonathan went to David and helped him to find strength in God again." So he didn't just go to him and help and support him. He helped him to find his strength in God again. And when we're in the doldrums, we so need people to come alongside us and just encourage us in our faith that God has not forgotten us and he is with us. And this is exactly what Jonathan did for David. And may we be able to do that for other people. So we move on. So David at this stage is hiding from Saul, who is pursuing him with fighting men of his own. And at one point, David and his men go into the cave to find cover, and King Saul comes inside the cave to relieve himself. And David's men encourage David to go and take Saul's life, a wonderful opportunity. David says he will not touch the Lord's anointed, so he cuts off a corner of Saul's cloak. And when Saul goes out of the cave, David calls to him and waves the part of the cloak to him, and just tells him afresh that, he's not out to kill King Saul. And so Saul realizes what a lucky escape he'd had, and he acknowledges that David will one day be king. He asks David to promise that he will not wipe out any of Saul's family, which of course David promises. So it seems it's all peaceful. Saul returns back to his palace, but interestingly, David does not. He knew that Saul was extremely mentally unstable, very volatile, and so he does not go back to be with Saul, but he stays, he remains, because he knows things are still not very safe. So at this stage, of course, David and his men, 600 of them, they would have been pretty hungry. And they see that it is sheep shearing time, and they are in the land where a landowner called Nabal lives. And Nabal, we are told, was a man who was surly and mean in all his dealings. And prior to that, when Nabal's men had been where David and his men had been, when all the shepherds had been there with the sheep, they had really looked after Nabal's men to make sure they weren't harmed, that their sheep were not taken, nothing was taken. So, and it says in the Bible that they formed almost like a wall around them to protect them. So, of course, David thinks, fair enough, I've helped Nabal's men, I'm sure he'll help us. And so he sends some of his men to Nabal to request that he might give his men food and drink as a return of the favour for how he had protected Nabal's men. We're told that Nabal was an incredibly wealthy man, so it's not that he didn't have enough food and drink to spare, but instead of finding out the truth that this is the case with his men, he's absolutely furious and says, David, who's David? I don't know anything about him. And so, in other words, get lost. I'm not going to help you. So David's men go back to him and they relay what has happened. David at this time is absolutely furious and says to his men, get your weapons. We're going to go up to Nabal and we're going to kill him and every male in his household. And the servants of Nabal get wind of this. They discover they know what's going to happen. And very tellingly, it says that one of them goes to Nabal's wife. And Nabal's wife is Abigail. And we're told that she's a very intelligent and beautiful woman. And one of the servants goes to Abigail, tells her what has happened, and says, please, think on this, but try and do something because disaster is hanging over our master and all his household. So if we just think again for a minute, there would have been a very big household. Nabal was a very wealthy man. And so how many men would that have been? There would have been a lot. So if David ends up killing all of them, they'd have been left with lots of widows and children, which would have been a complete disaster. So Abigail thinks quickly and says to her, the servants, to load up donkeys with provisions for David's men. And she sends them off ahead of her. And then she follows herself on a donkey. So she goes to meet with David. Remember, he's got 600 very fierce, very successful army fighting men. And she goes to plead for mercy on her household, for her household. When she meets David, she gets off, she bows down before him and says to him, please take no notice of my master, my husband Nabal. His name means fool, and indeed he is one. And then she says, let the blame be on me alone. Abigail was an amazing peacekeeper. She had done nothing wrong at all. And yet she says to David, let the blame be on me so that her household will find mercy. And again, I can't let this pass without thinking, we think further on in the Bible, we think about Jesus, who of course was the ultimate peacemaker. Let the blame of all our sin be upon him, that we might find that mercy and forgiveness and peace with God, both for now and eternity. David is humbled by this woman. She reminds him that she knows that he is the Lord's anointed, that he will one day be king, and she says, please remember me. But she also reminds him, God has called David into many battles, but this is not one of them. And she says, when you become king, I would not want, all the bloodshed of avenging yourself to be on your hands, on your head. And so she wanted him to keep that clear and clean conscience before God. And he was so taken with this and grateful to her. So Abigail goes back to her husband. It's a time of celebration with the shearing time. And Nabal at this stage is feasting and he's roaring drunk. So she very wisely says absolutely nothing to him about what has happened. And instead, she waits until the morning before she tells him. And I think it's interesting if you listen to Word for the Week when we talked about Rebecca. Rebecca deceived her husband Isaac because she wanted her favoured son Jacob to get the blessing. But here in this story, Abigail has no intention of deceiving her husband, and she tells him what she has done to avert disaster on his household. And we're told in the Bible that Nabal says nothing. His heart fails him and he's like stone for 10 days. So no doubt had a stroke, I imagine. And then he dies. And then when David hears that Nabal has died, he then remembers Abigail, just as she asked him to remember her. And he asks her to come and to be his wife, which she does. So if we think about the story of Abigail and what relevance does that have for you and I today? Well, either now or in the future, we might find ourselves in a very difficult situation, whether it be within a marriage, within a family, within work or community, living and working with very ungodly people. And yet Abigail, we see nowhere at all does she become bitter and resentful at living in a very difficult marriage, but instead she maintains her integrity. She was open and honest in her dealings, and yet also very wise and discerning. She was a woman who was totally realistic about her situation, and wonderfully she was available to others. How wonderful that the servants were able to come to her because they knew it was pointless going to their master. Abigail stood up for what she believed and she knew to be right. She didn't know how David would react when she went to him. Likewise, she wouldn't have known how her husband, her surly husband, would have reacted as well. She knew when to speak and when to remain silent. And she trusted God for his strength, his discernment, and his timing. And may that be true of you and I today.